Imagine a game whose rules you thought you knew, but as you played, you found you weren't so sure. Imagine it's the first international tournament of its kind. You're playing away from home and you've never flown abroad before. Imagine your opponent is a notoriously unpredictable and aggressive player.
Den deutschen Staat, das Deutsche Reich!
Oh, and by the way, the fate of the world depends on how you play. Winston Churchill coined the term summit to describe a top-level meeting where leaders play for the highest stakes at a defining moment in history. But it was Churchill's predecessor, a very different kind of negotiator, who pioneered modern summitry. In the summer of 1938, Adolf Hitler's armies were poised to invade Czechoslovakia. Europe was on the brink of catastrophic war. But then, in an extraordinary move, a brisk Birmingham businessman, armed only with his umbrella, turned the tables on Hitler. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, announced he would fly to meet the Führer, man to man, at his lair in the Bavarian Alps.
Discussions between him and me may have useful consequences.
His purpose? To bring peace to Europe. This was the birth of the modern summit. The air at the summit is exhilarating. It can inspire you to great deeds or blow you away with delusions of grandeur. Statesmen love to meet at the summit, confident that face to face with their adversaries, they can change the world through sheer force of personality. For 2 weeks, under the gaze of the whole world, Chamberlain raced against time to avoid war. But his final encounter with Hitler at Munich has become a cliché for craven surrender to the threat of force. Neville Chamberlain has gone down in history as a naive old buffer. Yet the reality is far more fascinating than the myth. In fact, it was the dictator, not the Democrat, who lost his nerve at the last moment. And I believe we've totally failed to appreciate the significance of Chamberlain's gamble. He started a new form of diplomacy that would decisively shape the rest of the 20th century. Summitry, Chamberlain's revolution, was made possible by air travel, made necessary by weapons of mass destruction, and made into household news by the mass media. Yet summits, for all their modernity, are rooted in individual human relationships. Two men trying to understand and manipulate each other in a battle of wills that can decide the fate of nations. Nazi Germany was Europe's rogue state. Its dictator had provoked one nerve-wracking crisis after another, reoccupying the Rhineland and annexing Austria, in effect tearing up the Treaty of Versailles, the peace deal that had concluded the First World War. The fate of Europe seemed to be in the hands of one man.
Und die Bewegung sind Lebensausdruck unseres Volkes und damit ein Symbol des Ewigen. Es lebe die nationalsozialistische Bewegung. Es lebe Deutschland.
In retrospect, Hitler's ambitions seem appallingly obvious, but they weren't so clear at the time. An aggressive demagogue in public, Germany's Führer was an intensely private man who opened himself up to virtually no one. For relaxation, he liked Wagner's operas, Mickey Mouse cartoons, and the Bavarian countryside. He was also an accomplished actor who could seem reasonable, even charming, to those foreigners he met. In short, it was hard to fathom what he really wanted. The question became urgent in 1938 when Hitler made new demands, this time over the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a multinational state created from the debris of the Habsburg Empire. A quarter of its people, the Sudetens, were German, and they were treated by the Czechs as second-class citizens. In response, they appealed for help from Berlin. Hitler threatened to invade Czechoslovakia on behalf of its beleaguered German people and absorb the Sudeten area, like Austria, into his expanding German Reich. It wasn't simply that Hitler intended to eliminate Czechoslovakia. The really important point, I think, is that he wanted to do so by war. Hitler had grown up in the German part of the Habsburg Empire, where there was visceral hatred of the Czechs. And, at a deeper level, he regarded war as natural and desirable. War would strengthen the German race in its struggle for survival. But if Germany attacked Czechoslovakia, France was bound by treaty to intervene. Hitler's generals feared that Germany would be sucked into a larger, Europe-wide conflict, for which, they argued, it was not yet ready. Hitler was having none of it. The ex-corporal was determined to impose his will on Germany's aristocratic officer corps.
It is my unalterable decision to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future.
Some senior generals were so alarmed that they began talking of a possible coup d'etat. Even Hitler's immediate entourage was split between hawks and doves. The foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, was a vehement Nazi who hated Britain and was egging Hitler on towards war. Among those urging caution were the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring, the air minister, whom the British cultivated as a moderate in the battle for the Führer's ear and heart. The signals from Berlin to the outside world were mixed, and this encouraged hopes in London of a negotiated settlement. But British leaders never understood that Hitler's mind was made up. He was determined to take Czechoslovakia by force to prove his virility. In Britain, another politician was engaged in a similar ego trip. But his ambition was very different: to solve the Czech crisis as a first step to peace in Europe.
Britain has always had the uncanny power, when crisis and danger have threatened our lives, of being able to produce the man of the moment.
Neville Chamberlain started out as a minor character in one of Britain's great industrial and political dynasties. His father Joseph was the titan of late Victorian politics, but never made it to the premiership.
This is one of the few actual films existing of the great man taken just before he died.
Neville's elder brother, Austin, was groomed to take up the torch. He read history at Cambridge, went straight into politics, and became a long-serving foreign secretary.
While Joseph Chamberlain's elder son Austin was a rising politician, his half-brother Neville was intended for commerce. In the early 90s...
Neville, by contrast, stayed at home in Birmingham. He studied metallurgy as a prelude to local business and civic politics. He didn't become an MP till he was nearly 50.
But what of the inner thoughts of this man of many activities? Behind the mask of the cool, efficient statesman is a deeply sincere human being.
To the outside world, the Chamberlains seem united by powerful clan loyalty. Yet Neville, the late developer, was always measuring himself against his father and brother. He could not forget the evening in 1925 when Austin returned home after brokering the Locarno Treaty between France and Germany. Neville had to sit for 3 long hours listening to Austin droning on about his achievements, for which he later won the Nobel Peace Prize. As the marginal man in this fiercely proud dynasty, Neville would have been less than human if he didn't seek the chance to outdo his father and his brother. In the 1930s, that opportunity finally arrived. As Austin's career fizzled out, Neville's took off. He served as a successful reforming Chancellor of the Exchequer, presiding over Britain's recovery from the Great Depression.
This little battered old box has held all the secrets of the budget right back to Mr. Gladstone's time.
Chamberlain was not only an efficient administrator, he had a keen sense of political theatre and was very astute at promoting his image in front of the newsreel cameras.
Another surplus? How on earth do you manage it?
Each of the 4 last budgets was a little better than the one before, and I did hope that the 5th was going to outclass all the others. Instead of that, well, there it is.
Finally, at the age of 68, Neville gained what his father and brother had failed to achieve: the premiership. This wasn't power for its own sake. Like all his generation, Chamberlain was haunted by the horrors of the Great War. He had never recovered from the loss of his cousin and closest friend, Norman, on the Western Front. That's why Chamberlain was committed to appeasement. At this stage, not a dirty word, but the laudable aim of bringing peace. Chamberlain believed that the old diplomacy of ambassadors and telegrams was outmoded. When dealing with an all-powerful dictator, one man had to play the cards on behalf of the democracies, especially if the dictator was as volatile as Hitler. Winston Churchill called for a blunt threat of war to counter German aggression. But Chamberlain believed, given the uncertainty about Hitler's psychology, that caution was required. Every week, Chamberlain wrote a long and candid letter to his spinster sisters. Here, he revealed his take on Hitler.
Is it not positively horrible to think that the fate of hundreds of millions depends on the man?
And he is half mad. When Chamberlain and his colleagues talked about the dangers of war, they didn't just mean a conflict in Central Europe or even a German attack on France. They believed that Hitler's air force would mount an immediate and massive assault on London, home to 1/5 of the country's population, and it was assumed that there was no defence. The chilling cliché of the time had it that the bomber will always get through.
Approaching every town. An air raid is approaching every town. Gas masks are being distributed. See them get tightly behind the hill. Get for cover. Get under cover at once. The enemy are not getting great force, but our anti-aircraft gunners will speedily destroy them.
The threat of a knockout blow from the air terrorized the popular imagination in the 1930s. It featured in books and films. People thought of air warfare much as we imagine nuclear war today. In fact, British intelligence got it fundamentally wrong. In 1938, the Luftwaffe hadn't got planes with sufficient range or bomb loads to inflict serious damage on London. Had Chamberlain and his colleagues understood the limits of German air power, they might have been ready to call Hitler's bluff and risk war. Instead, and not for the last time, a British government got it wrong about weapons of mass destruction.
Events have become too serious for criticism or discussion. From now on, my duty will be to return refugees are still crossing the borders of Czechoslovakia into Germany. There, the men are being organized into the Sudeten Freikorps, and miniature armies, crossing back into Sudeten territory to attack the Czech guards.
Meanwhile, Czechoslovakia continued to implode. In early September, new rioting among the Sudetens prompted the Prague government to impose martial law. Events were playing into Hitler's hands. The Nazi leadership voiced outrage. British diplomats continued negotiations in the traditional manner to arrange self-rule for the Sudeten region. But war in Europe now seemed just days away. So late on September the 13th, Chamberlain intervened personally in the crisis. This was the genesis of summitry. He would launch what he called Plan Z, an attempt to strike a deal over Sudeten self-rule face to face with Hitler. He would literally descend from the clouds in that most admired yet feared invention of the 20th century, the aeroplane. Chamberlain realised that the aeroplane could be an instrument of diplomacy as well as a weapon of war. Flying to Germany would be a spectacular gesture that could stop Hitler in his tracks and allow Britain to seize the initiative. The alternative of inviting the Führer to London
would not have suited me, for it would have deprived my coup of much of its dramatic force.
What's more, Chamberlain's repeated belief that he might be dealing with some kind of lunatic strengthened his wish to meet the reclusive dictator. A personal encounter would allow Chamberlain to form his own judgment of Hitler's sanity. Perhaps he could even divert the German leader from some crazy act. Peacemaking had become a personal mission for Chamberlain. Having reached the top of Britain's political ladder, he was keen to step out onto the world stage. A distinct note of arrogance was creeping in. As Chancellor, he told his sisters, "I could hardly have moved a pebble. But now, as Prime Minister, I have only to raise a finger, and the whole face of Europe is changed." Summitry was the natural expression of Chamberlain's presidential style as Premier. Through a one-on-one summit, Chamberlain could circumvent critics in the Cabinet and the Foreign Office. Chamberlain relied on a small coterie led by Samuel Hoare, the Home Secretary, and Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, a principled High Anglican but also a pragmatic politician, hence his nickname, Holy Fox. Yet his closest advisor on foreign affairs was not a cabinet minister or a diplomat at all, but Sir Horace Wilson, a career civil servant who'd made his name as a statistical wizard. Chamberlain was careful to keep Plan Z under wraps. He announced the summit to the full cabinet only after he'd already sent his message to Hitler.
In view of the increasingly critical situation, I propose to come over at once to see you with a view to trying to find a peaceful solution. I propose to come by air, and am ready to start tomorrow.
This was a bold leap of imagination, one of the most dramatic gestures in 20th century diplomacy. And for the first time, the Nazi leaders were knocked off balance. Hitler was at the Berghof, his alpine retreat near Berchtesgaden, when he received news of Chamberlain's proposal of a summit. The Führer had always dismissed the idea of British intervention in the crisis. He thought it was all bluff and said he would refuse to see any British ministers or diplomats. But Hitler couldn't refuse to meet the British Prime Minister. Was he coming to warn that Britain was ready to march? The man whom all Europe feared just didn't know how to read Chamberlain's gambit. It had forced a delay in Hitler's countdown to war. The news of their meeting was announced to the world on the evening of the 14th of September 1938. Not everyone was impressed. When the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini heard of the summit, he exclaimed,
"This is the liquidation of English prestige. England has hit the canvas. As soon as Hitler sees this old man, he will know he has won the game."
Yet next morning, in the British press, almost all the comment was favourable.
One of the boldest and most dramatic strokes in modern diplomatic
This dramatic event, without precedent in history, transforms the whole international situation.
The turnaround in national mood was profound. It began an emotional roller coaster, 2 weeks that have etched themselves deeply into popular memory. Chamberlain left Number 10 early on Thursday the 15th of September. The Prime Minister was dressed exactly as for his morning stroll in the park, noted an Evening Standard reporter, and he carried a rolled umbrella. The umbrella evoked comment the world over and later became something of a joke. But, like Winston Churchill's cigar or Clement Attlee's pipe, it was Chamberlain's trademark, tailored to his cautious, businesslike image.
A gasp of amazement and satisfaction runs round the world. The Prime Minister decides to fly to a personal meeting with the German Chancellor.
Since he took office, Mr. Chamberlain has never wavered in his determination to establish peace in Europe.
From Downing Street, Chamberlain was driven to Heston Airfield in West London. He made a brief statement for the newsreels, which further raised expectations.
My policy has always been to try to ensure peace, and the Führer's ready acceptance of my suggestion encourages me to hope that my visit to him will not be without result.
So at Heston, after 69 years of a busy life, Mr. Chamberlain makes his first trip in a plane, and the world prays fervently that the roar of this plane, this dramatic meeting, this man of the moment, may bring peace.
The media stated that Chamberlain had never flown before. This wasn't literally true. He'd once taken a spin around Birmingham Airfield on a demonstration flight. But that was a far cry from this 4-hour journey to southern Germany. Regular progress reports were sent to the anxious Mrs. Chamberlain.
Machine passed over Dunkirk, 9:20. 10:35, 38 kilometres past Cologne. Going well, weather clear.
Chamberlain later confessed in a letter to some nervous moments as they came down blind through a rainstorm into Munich, while the plane
rocked and bumped like a ship in the sea.
But when the Prime Minister landed at Munich Aerodrome, he bounded out of the plane and put on a brave face for Ribbentrop, who was there to welcome him.
Thus, the first stage of the Premier's historic journey was safely accomplished.
From Munich, there was a train ride to Berchtesgaden. The crowd shouted Heil. Chamberlain kept raising his hat in what one journalist called his democratic salute. The Prime Minister, Ribbentrop and their two staffs then swept off in a fleet of cars to Hitler's headquarters on the Obersalzberg, high above the town. Summitry requires statesmen to develop a personal relationship. The chemistry between them has a direct bearing on the course of international relations. But Chamberlain was unimpressed when he first met the Führer. He told his sisters that Hitler looked
entirely undistinguished. You would never notice him in a crowd and would take him for the house painter he once was.
To his cabinet later, Chamberlain was even more candid.
The commonest little dog I have ever seen.
For his part, Hitler found the British Prime Minister
ice cold.
Now at the brink, it was time for tea. Chamberlain quickly found that Hitler was not one for small talk.
I have often heard of this room, but it's much larger than I expected.
It is you who have the big rooms in England.
You must come and see them sometime.
I should be received with demonstrations of disapproval.
Well, perhaps it would be wise to choose the moment.
At this, Hitler managed the shadow of a smile. Then abruptly he asked how they should proceed, and Chamberlain said he wished to talk one-to-one. The Prime Minister didn't want diplomats in the way. He wanted to bypass malevolent advisers, particularly Ribbentrop. And that's why Halifax, Ribbentrop's opposite number, had been deliberately left at home. So, accompanied only by Dr. Paul Schmidt, the interpreter, the two leaders went upstairs to Hitler's sitting room, where summitry would begin in earnest. Chamberlain was doing it solo and without props. No advisors, no briefing books. It would all come down to his skill in playing the cards. Chamberlain wanted to sense out his opponent before getting down to the hard detail. So he proposed to Hitler that they devote that afternoon to clarifying each other's view of Europe, and then deal with Czechoslovakia the next day. But Hitler deftly knocked Chamberlain off course. He declared that Czechoslovakia was very urgent and could not wait, because 300 Sudeten Germans had been killed that day. Almost certainly Hitler knew this was totally untrue, but it allowed him to seize the initiative. "All right," said Chamberlain, "go ahead." What followed was rambling and at times very excited. Hitler rarely moved in smooth, straight lines. Hitler's key point was that he'd promised the German people he would bring Germans from Austria and Czechoslovakia into the Reich. The Führer was at pains to say that Germans farther afield were a different case. Having dealt with Austria, all he was now interested in was the Sudeten question. This was the spearhead in his side. The dictator ended with a threat. "I am willing to risk a world war rather than allow this to drag on." So far, Chamberlain had hardly managed to get a word in. But now he tried to turn Hitler's outburst to his advantage by putting his own spin on what the Führer had said. He observed that Hitler had just stated clearly that after the Sudeten question he had no more territorial demands that might give rise to conflict. Chamberlain added that it ought to be possible for the two of them to prevent a world war on account of these 3 million Sudeten Germans. Chamberlain suggested that they make a joint appeal to both parties in Czechoslovakia to refrain from violence. Hitler exploded. Angrily bringing up the 300 dead again, he insisted that the problem had to be solved immediately. Now Chamberlain lost his cool for the first time. "I am wondering why Herr Hitler let me come to Germany when his mind is so firmly made up. I have wasted my time." Hitler's tirades usually cowed his opponents, but Chamberlain had struck back, and to the surprise of Schmidt the interpreter, stopped Hitler in his tracks. But then, sidestepping, Hitler asked bluntly whether Britain would agree to the Sudeten regions simply being handed over to the Reich. Negotiations so far had only been about autonomy for the Sudeten Germans within Czechoslovakia, so Hitler's new demand raised the stakes dramatically. And it worked. Chamberlain said that he personally accepted the idea of transferring population and territory, but he added that he would have to consult the cabinet and the French and examine all the practicalities. Chamberlain had made a big concession. Having gone to talk only about self-rule for the Sudetens, he just agreed to a transfer of Czech territory to Germany. The Prime Minister had chosen to embark on the game of symmetry, but Hitler had played his hand more skillfully, and both men must have realised that. Chamberlain had lost ground, geographically and psychologically. The two men went downstairs and collected the rest of the British party, who were sitting in embarrassed silence, having long since run out of chit-chat. Hitler was much more friendly than when they went up, proposing that Chamberlain pay a further visit to see the scenery when all this is over. Cabinet colleagues and even his wife read with complete surprise in next morning's papers that the Prime Minister was on his way home. The summit had turned out very differently from the 3 or 4 day epic widely expected.
I've come back again. Rather quicker than I expected. It was a frank talk, but it was a friendly one.
And I feel satisfied now that each of us fully understands what is in the mind of the other.
Chamberlain had made what he deemed a prudent concession to prevent imminent war. But unlike Hitler, he was a democratic statesman. Could he carry his cabinet and make the agreement stick? Summits are intense, often intimate, personal occasions. But their results have to be sold in the cold light of day to colleagues who have not been caught up in the mood of the moment. To strengthen his case, Chamberlain therefore described the meeting in the starkest possible terms. He said that on arrival at Berchtesgaden, it became clear that the situation was one of desperate urgency. If he'd not gone, he thought that hostilities would have started by now. And he presented his threat to go home as perhaps the turning point of the conversation, after which Herr Hitler became quieter in his manner and a more rational discussion ensued. Chamberlain also made a crucial point about psychology. At times, Hitler would lose the thread of what he was saying and go off into a tirade, but Chamberlain said he'd seen no signs of insanity. And he'd formed the opinion that Hitler's objectives were strictly limited. In saying this, Chamberlain was rejecting the view he'd entertained before Berchtesgaden, that Hitler might be mad. Instead, in a big change, he now presented the German leader as a determined and volatile opponent, but a man with whom he could do business.
The impression made by the PM's story was a little painful,
noted one cabinet colleague in his diary.
It was plain that H had made all the running. He had in fact blackmailed the PM.
Yet despite such scepticism about Chamberlain's spin, there was no cabinet revolt. The important point is that even open critics offered no alternatives for dealing with the Nazi dictator. They acquiesced in a negotiated transfer of territory. Everyone in the cabinet shared the paranoia about bombing. No one was willing to sacrifice London for the sake of Prague.
Following Mr. Chamberlain's return from Germany, Monsieur Daladier, the French Premier, flew to Croydon to learn from the British cabinet what had been said in the talks with Herr Hitler.
The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Chamberlain as he worked to stitch up the deal he'd conceded at Berchtesgaden. He persuaded Edouard Daladier's French government, an ally of Czechoslovakia, to agree to a transfer of Sudeten territory. The Czechs were then bullied into line. Chamberlain intended to remain in charge of the negotiations, but this meant that Britain, hitherto aloof from entanglements in Eastern Europe, was now taking responsibility for a transparently one-sided deal. In public, moral outrage was growing, with speeches by Churchill and Anthony Eden, and demonstrations by the Labour Party and the trades unions.
The fate of Czechoslovakia inspires concern among peoples as well as governments. This meeting in Trafalgar Square appears to have prejudged the results of the Hitler-Chamberlain meeting at Göteborg.
There was a marked change in public opinion, but it had not registered with Chamberlain, who was now obsessed with his peace mission. The inner cabinet and the press barons warned the Prime Minister that the British people would expect real concessions from Hitler at their next meeting. So when the Prime Minister left for his second summit with Hitler, the mood was not euphoric like a week before. There were even some boos from the crowd.
European peace is what I am aiming at, and I hope that this journey may open the way to get it.
Hitler had recognized the publicity potential of summits. This time, he instructed Goebbels to greet Chamberlain with Nazi pomp and pageantry.
Mr. Chamberlain's plane landed at Cologne Airport, and the Premier was greeted by Herr von Ribbentrop, the German Foreign Minister. There were smiles and howls on all sides from Britain's ambassador for peace.
From Cologne Airfield, the Prime Minister and his party were driven down gleaming new autobahns to the spa town of Bad Godesberg, and ensconced in the grandiose Hotel Petersburg, overlooking the Rhine. Like an opposing army, Hitler and the Nazi leadership were across the river in the Hotel Dresden. where, rather ominously, the Führer had plotted the Night of the Long Knives, his notorious purge of 1934. In the afternoon, Chamberlain and his party drove down to the Rhine and crossed on the ferry, in full view of a huge crowd of pressmen and spectators. At the Dresden, he shook hands with Hitler and they went upstairs with their interpreters. There was a moment's silence as the two men met face to face once again. Then Hitler gestured to Chamberlain. The Prime Minister reminded Hitler of the deadlock before their last meeting. Then he outlined the idea of an agreed transfer of territory overseen by an international commission and explained how he had successfully brought London, Paris and Prague behind this plan. Finally, he sat back with an expression of satisfaction. Chamberlain had shown his willingness to cooperate. Now the ball was in Hitler's court. Hitler thanked Chamberlain for his great efforts to reach a peaceful solution. Chamberlain smiled graciously. But then Hitler looked grave. "I'm extremely sorry, but it's no longer any use." Chamberlain sat up with a start, his face flushed with anger, while Hitler launched into a lengthy diatribe about the untenable situation at the frontier. He went on about the escalating armed clashes and the constant stream of refugees. The whole problem, he declared, must be finally and completely solved by the 1st of October at the latest. Again, he was making outrageous demands to bring on the war that he yearned for. Hitler had wrong-footed his opponent badly. But by the time the interpreter finished, Chamberlain was able to collect himself. He said that he had obtained everything Hitler had asked for without the expenditure of a drop of German blood. In doing so, the Prime Minister went on with rising indignation, "I have been obliged to take my political life in my hands." Hitler backtracked a little. He said there was only one way to resolve the situation peacefully. They must agree a frontier immediately, without any reference to international commissions. He proposed that the boundary should follow the language line. Not only that, the area must be occupied by German troops at once. Chamberlain wouldn't let go. He tried to pin the Führer down on specifics. The conversation became increasingly scrappy as Hitler kept exploding about Czech atrocities. Tired and hungry, they agreed to resume in the morning. The British retreated back across the Rhine. The mood was grim. Chamberlain dispatched a telegram to Halifax.
First meeting, unsatisfactory.
Once again, Hitler had pulled the rug from under Chamberlain's feet. At Godesberg, as at Berchtesgaden, the Prime Minister had arrived with what he considered a sensible and attractive package. But each time, Hitler simply upped his demands, skillfully extracting concessions. Yet, despite Hitler's continuing hunch that Britain wouldn't go to war, it's clear, I think, that he couldn't quite get the measure of Chamberlain. On the one hand, Hitler was still talking of war and preparing for it. But on the other, the British leader had become much more actively involved in the crisis. The Prime Minister's summitry had introduced an element of unpredictability into the Führer's plans. Chamberlain was far more unsettled. He'd returned from Berchtesgaden convinced Hitler was not mad, and had acted on that assumption with characteristic energy. Yet now, Hitler was behaving in a way that defied rationality, making demands that cabinet colleagues had clearly warned were unacceptable. The summitry Chamberlain had initiated was spinning out of his control. And Chamberlain was increasingly isolated. His inner cabinet was bombarding him with requests for information, while making contingency plans for possible war. the Prime Minister had no choice but to cancel the planned meeting next morning. He sent over a letter spelling out exactly why Hitler's new proposals could not be met. Waiting for an answer, Chamberlain paced the terrace of his hotel. He told his advisor, Horace Wilson, that he feared for his premiership if the talks collapsed. It was the first time this intensely guarded Prime Minister had made such a confession. All day, messages went to and fro across the river as Chamberlain tried to pin Hitler down to a clear statement of his demands. Eventually, he was promised a memorandum with maps. In the evening, the British crossed the river once more. As the leaders met again, it became clear that the German memorandum required the Czechoslovaks to evacuate the Sudetenland within days, by September the 28th.
Harsh voices roar threats of force and bloodshed. Men are on the march, even while the drums roll for Mr. Chamberlain's arrival.
The memorandum is an ultimatum, not a negotiation, exclaimed Chamberlain. It has the word memorandum at the top, retorted Hitler. I am more impressed by the contents than the title, Chamberlain shot back. The memorandum would have a very bad effect on British public opinion. People would say that Hitler was behaving like a conqueror. No, Hitler cut in, like the owner of his property. As Schmidt translated the document into English, Chamberlain sniped away at the most objectionable points, including the phrase, "The following demands are made by the German government." Hitler agreed to replace demands with proposals. Chamberlain then denounced the document's peremptory and rigid timetable. Hitler again backed off a fraction, agreeing to a completion date of the 1st of October. After working to reduce the area to be occupied by German troops, Chamberlain said he would submit the proposals to Prague. Near the end, Hitler gave Chamberlain a penetrating stare and said, "You are the first man to whom I have ever made a concession." Yet in the entrance hall, the two leaders had a much more amiable conversation. Chamberlain clearly still hoped that Summitry had a future. He referred to the relationship of confidence that had grown up between them in the last few days, allowing each to speak very frankly without the other taking offence. Hitler agreed, and Chamberlain took his leave with a hearty Auf Wiedersehen. The tone of Gotesburg was ambiguous. Once again, Hitler had raised the stakes, and Chamberlain was taken aback. But this time he played a harder game, forcing the Führer to put his demands down on paper and then to modify them. Even so, what was being asked of the Czechs was appalling. But Chamberlain didn't care. Having gambled his political future on Summitry, he climbed too far to turn back now.
I am exceedingly grateful to you all for the gracious welcome that you've given to me on my visits to your country.
Now he would once again report to his cabinet. He would give a positive account of the visit, admitting his indignation on the first day when Hitler upped his demands, but saying that after further conversation, the Führer had made some concessions.
Herr Hitler had a narrow mind and was violently prejudiced on certain subjects. But he would not deliberately deceive a man whom he respected and with whom he had been in negotiation.
Chamberlain said he was sure Hitler now felt some respect for him.
When Herr Hitler announced that he meant to do something, it was certain that he would do it.
Did Chamberlain really believe that? after twice being given the runaround by Hitler, the Prime Minister told the cabinet he was sure that the Führer was telling the truth when he said that after the Sudetenland he had no more territorial ambitions in Europe. Was Chamberlain just incredibly naive? Or was he in so deep that he had no choice but to persuade himself that Hitler was telling the truth? Chamberlain told his colleagues he could now see no hope for a peaceful solution except on the basis of Hitler's memorandum as modified in the late-night talks. The cabinet would have to decide whether the differences between these proposals and those he'd taken to the summit were sufficient to justify Britain going to war. To underline his point, Chamberlain spoke movingly of flying home to London that morning up the Thames. He'd imagined a German bomber on the same course and asked himself what protection the government could give to the thousands of homes spread out beneath him. Although Chamberlain's inner circle was at first supportive, the following day it rebelled. Hoare suggested it would be a tremendous responsibility to advise the Prague government to accept these terms. And Halifax, who'd had a sleepless night after lobbying from the Foreign Office, said that Hitler
had given us nothing, and that he was dictating terms just as though he had won a war, but without having had the fight.
In a protracted cabinet meeting, some ministers made clear their support for Chamberlain, but others took their cue from Hoare and Halifax, voicing previously stifled doubts, and there was talk of possible resignations. Chamberlain, like other prime ministers since, found that his presidential style had provoked a backlash. The cabinet was now reasserting its authority. Then, during the afternoon, the Czechs and the French rejected the Godesberg terms. Daladier said they were an attempt to destroy Czechoslovakia by force, enslaving her. Chamberlain realised he had to give ground. But determined not to lose control completely, he told ministers he would send his personal emissary, Horace Wilson, to Berlin with a final appeal. Hitler was furious to learn from Wilson that Czechoslovakia had not caved in. He jumped up and down like a defiant boy, according to interpreter Paul Schmidt. So Wilson rose reluctantly to give the warning that British hardliners had been demanding. The most important message in Anglo-German relations in 20 years, delivered not by a diplomat, but by Chamberlain's over-promoted statistician. If Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, and if France went to war on behalf of the Czechs, Britain would feel obliged to fight alongside France. Yet Hitler was still intent on invading Czechoslovakia. Even the date was set, Saturday the 1st of October. Soon after Wilson left Berlin, he ordered the units that would spearhead the invasion to start moving to their assembly areas. He also approved full mobilization of the German armed forces to begin at 2 p.m. on Wednesday the 28th. In London, events were moving towards a dreaded climax. The Prime Minister now agreed to the mobilisation of the fleet. This was announced in the press the next morning, further ratcheting up the tension.
I'm wobbling about all over the place,
said Chamberlain. He was now exhausted.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. It seems still more impossible that a quarrel which is already settled in principle should be the subject of war. But I am going to work for peace to the last moment.
In the morning, the Prime Minister made one last desperate effort. He sent a telegram to Hitler offering to come yet again to Germany. He said he was convinced that
you can get all the essentials without war and without delay.
In a parallel message, the Prime Minister asked Mussolini to urge Hitler to accept this proposal. But what happened next owed nothing to Chamberlain. Most of Tuesday afternoon, a German division paraded through the streets of Berlin and along the Wilhelmstrasse, passing the Chancellery. Hitler, who loved to watch his army, created from the ashes of Versailles, stood at the window for 3 hours. The whole event was staged to impress foreign diplomats and newsmen with Germany's military might. But what struck them, and Hitler himself, was the reaction of Berliners. Hardly anyone cheered. People turned their heads or ducked into doorways. Germans, it seemed, had no stomach for another European conflict. Yet, as Hitler had said again and again, success in war depended on the people's will as much as on the military's weaponry. The Führer was very angry, but also very chastened. The following morning, Wednesday the 28th, pressures on Hitler mounted. The British position was now clear thanks to Wilson's reluctant warning and news that the Royal Navy had mobilised. In another well-publicised move, the French called up reservists. That morning, the Chancellery building in Berlin was even more chaotic than usual, with officers and officials milling around, excitedly trading the latest gossip. The mood was definitely against risking a European war. Among Hitler's inner circle, the only real hawks were Ribbentrop and Himmler. Goering pressed his arguments for peace at length. He accused Ribbentrop to his face of warmongering. "I know what war is like," he shouted. "And if the Führer orders it, I shall be in the first plane, but you will be in the seat beside me." Hitler now received an urgent message from Mussolini, urging the Führer to delay his war plans and accept Chamberlain's proposal for a new summit. Mussolini, delighted at the chance to get into the limelight, was offering himself in the role of mediator.
The point of difference is very small.
It was almost noon, just 2 hours before the 2 p.m. trigger for general mobilization. Hitler thought hard and then said, "Tell the Duce I accept his proposal." It was an amazing turnaround. Hitler, the man who believed you could do anything through willpower, had wimped out. But in doing so, he probably saved his own life. Summitry often has domestic ramifications, but this was a rare occasion where it nearly led to regime change. It's now clear that Hitler's apparently suicidal determination to risk a war with Britain and France had provoked mounting opposition in the German military, even mutterings of a coup d'etat. It was now that a plot was hatched to take control of Berlin, surround the Chancellery, and overthrow the Führer. There were as yet no extensive security preparations in place to protect Hitler, and a raiding party was ready to burst in and gun him down. But then came the bombshell news. Hitler had pulled back from the brink and there was to be another conference at Munich. The plotters had no choice but to stay their hand. After the war, some of them laid the blame on Chamberlain. But Britain was now reluctantly preparing for war. It wasn't Chamberlain who saved Hitler. Hitler saved himself. But in London, nobody yet knew of Hitler's about-face. Chamberlain was due to speak to the House of Commons to explain his part in the Czech crisis and, effectively, the countdown to European war. Millions had woken up on Wednesday the 28th of September, fearing it might be their last day. Chamberlain's account of his talks with Hitler was compelling theatre, but he must have been painfully aware that he lacked a punchline. He just got to the part about his final appeals that morning to Hitler and Mussolini, when an urgent message from the Foreign Office was passed to him. According to one observer, his face, His whole body seemed to change. He looked 10 years younger. He was triumphant.
I have now been informed by Herr Hitler that he invites me to meet him at Munich tomorrow morning. I need not say what my answer will be.
There's a stately gentleman we love so.
The Commons erupted in wild cheering. MPs stood on the seats, throwing their order papers in the air.
How you fought for peace and liberty. God bless you, Mr. Chamberlain.
Amid the hubbub, Chamberlain proposed that the debate be adjourned for a few days, after which
perhaps we may meet in happier circumstances.
So carry on, Mr. Chamberlain. You know we're all...
It was an amazing piece of brinkmanship. Chamberlain himself later called it the last desperate snatch, the last tuft, at the very verge of the precipice.
Almighty proud of you. You look swell.
Next morning, the atmosphere in London was like that of 2 weeks before, when Chamberlain made his first flight to Germany. There had been almost an explosion of relief that war had been averted, at least for the moment.
Yes, no man has ever deserved more richly the title of peacemaker than Mr. Chamberlain leaving for the Four-Power Conference of Munich. And there were happy faces among the British ministers who came to Heston to wish the Premier Godspeed on his journey.
The whole cabinet saw Chamberlain off.
When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, out of this nettle danger, we pluck this flower safely. When I was a little boy, I used to repeat, if at first you don't succeed, try again. That's what I'm doing.
Jaundiced critics rendered it, if at first you don't concede, fly again. But that Thursday, the critics were few, and they kept silent. Even Churchill, fearful that the Prime Minister would sacrifice the Czechs, but forced to wait impotently on events. As a summit, Munich would be very different from the one-to-one encounters at Berchtesgaden and Godesberg. Hitler and Chamberlain were to be joined by Daladier and Mussolini, the Italian leader relishing his role as broker. On the overnight train from Rome, he'd been full of contemptuous observations about the British. He ascribed the country's passion for peace to the gender imbalance after the Great War.
4 million sexually deprived women, unable to embrace a man, they embrace all of humanity.
Chamberlain and his party flew in at noon to be told that proceedings would start at once. The Prime Minister was driven through cheering crowds to the Nazi headquarters in the centre of Munich. The two Democrats were dressed in dark suits, the dictators in military uniform. They all sat not around a table, but in a large circle, with Chamberlain too far away from the uneasy and subdued Daladier to confer. There was no proper record-keeping and no formal agenda. So Mussolini took the lead, proudly dispensing with translation into Italian because he fancied himself as a linguist. He read out his proposals as a basis for discussion. In fact, these had been prepared for him by the Germans and were based on the Godesberg discussions. Chamberlain, still trying to recover from his early concessions, pushed for a slower timetable and a slight reduction in the precise areas in question. These were minor changes of form, not substance, to the deal dictated at Godesberg. But Hitler was irritated, likening Chamberlain to a haggling shopkeeper. The delegations then made uneasy small talk as they waited for Chamberlain's amendments to be written into the agreement. The document was finally ready for signature at 2 in the morning. The great moment had arrived. The 4 delegations trooped into Hitler's room, where an enormous desk was topped off by a massive inkpot. Hitler dipped in his pen, only to discover that there was no ink. Another inkpot had to be hastily produced. It was an act finale to a shambolic summit.
And so at Hitler's Munich headquarters, the agreement that has made the biggest headlines since the armistice. Let no man criticize the bargain that the statesmen of Britain and France have struck until he attempted to add up the total price that might have had to be paid for any other settlement. A price in death and destruction. That price will not be paid. There will be peace.
The Czechs, whose country was being carved up, were not even present. Their representatives were informed of the terms later by Chamberlain and Daladier, and told that if they didn't accept, they would have to deal with Germany themselves. But Chamberlain must have known that he needed to take more than this back to London. While waiting for the draftsmen to finish their work, he had asked Hitler for a further talk that morning. Chamberlain rose early to prepare. Once again, it was summitry on the hoof. Over breakfast at his hotel, Chamberlain hurriedly concocted a short statement for Hitler to sign. He did so with the help of William Strang, a token Foreign Office advisor. Strang was not at all happy, but Chamberlain brushed aside his reservations. The Prime Minister was determined that today, he and Hitler would begin a new era in Anglo-German relations. This time, the two men met at Hitler's private apartment in the Munich suburbs. With Czechoslovakia apparently resolved, Chamberlain could at last tackle Hitler on the broader problems facing Europe. They talked about the Spanish Civil War and the threat of aerial bombing, as Chamberlain assiduously took notes. Hate's idea of little babies being killed by gas bombs. Chamberlain seems to have discerned in such comments a sign that he and Hitler shared a common sense of human decency. Eventually, Chamberlain said it would be a pity if the Munich meeting passed off with nothing more than the settlement of the Czech question. He had therefore drafted a short statement about their mutual desire to improve Anglo-German relations and thereby enhance European stability. Pulling the document out of his pocket, he asked if Hitler would sign. This was the notorious piece of paper. In Chamberlain's mind, it was a sign that the two leaders were ready to move on towards a Europe-wide settlement, the climax of his summitry. But how did Hitler see it? According to Schmidt, the interpreter, the Führer was pale and moody throughout the meeting, saying little. This Schmidt attributed to Chamberlain's rapturous reception in Munich. Wherever the Prime Minister went, he was cheered through the streets, and his hotel had been deluged with floral tributes. Hitler was never one to share the limelight, and that may have been one reason for his morose mood that morning. More deeply, Hitler was now surely coming to terms with what he'd done by losing his nerve at the last minute. He was furious at having been cheated out of the glory of victorious war. Even more galling, he knew that he had cheated himself. But he signed. The signature meant nothing to Hitler. But even now, Chamberlain clung to his faith in gentlemanly honour. Back at his hotel, Chamberlain patted his pocket in satisfaction and told Strang, "I've got it."
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
There was no sign of British reserve as the crowds fought to get near the Premier's car. As we travelled back with Mr. Chamberlain from Heston, we drove through serried masses of happy people, happy in the knowledge that there was no war with Germany.
Even in his wildest dreams as a peacemaker, nothing could have prepared Chamberlain for his reception back in London. Despite pouring rain, the crowds were vast.
The Premier drove straight to Buckingham Palace. Here he was received by the King while London waited. History was made again when Their Majesties came out onto that famous balcony with the Prime Minister.
As requested by the King, he drove to Buckingham Palace and, in an unprecedented gesture, acknowledged cheering Londoners from the front balcony. Finally, and with great difficulty, the car took him back to Downing Street. Chamberlain was exhausted from many late nights and from 2 weeks of intense drama. He admitted later he'd been close to a nervous breakdown. But the Prime Minister was also exultant at having, as he'd hoped, plucked the flower from the nettle. In the packed entrance hall of 10 Downing Street, someone urged the Prime Minister to repeat Disraeli's famous words on returning from the Congress of Berlin, that he brought back peace with honour. "No," Chamberlain retorted icily. "I do not do that sort of thing." But when he went upstairs to acknowledge the crowds, he was conscious that he did so at the window from which Disraeli had spoken 60 years before. It was now that Chamberlain made one last error of judgment. The scenes in London that evening would have gone to any man's head. Possibly voicing that deep yearning to outdo his father and his brother, Chamberlain let his emotions get the better of his reason.
My good friends, this is the second time in our history there has come back from Germany to Downing Street peace with honour. I believe it is peace for our time.
Those words would haunt him for the rest of his days.
In Durchführung des Abkommens von München setzten sich am 1. Oktober mittags um 14 Uhr die deutschen Truppen in Bewegung, um dem deutschen Sudetenlande Ruhe, Ordnung und Frieden zu geben. Grenzenloser Jubel empfing sie allenthalben. Die trifft in der kleinen Stadt Asch ein.
As agreed, Hitler took over the Sudetenland in October 1938. Despite the general relief that this had not provoked a European war, there were still voices of dissent. Churchill publicly denounced the Munich settlement as a total and unmitigated defeat.
The belief that security can be obtained by throwing a small state to the wolves is a fatal delusion.
It was a prophetic warning.
Once again, the rattle of a German army on the march echoes in Europe. Where that march may end, no man can foretell, least of all the man who gave the order. But here before our eyes unfolds the drama of a nation dying.
In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. This not only took him beyond his professed aim of simply bringing Germans within the Reich. Worse still for Chamberlain, he had torn up the Munich agreements in which the Prime Minister had placed such faith. Chamberlain had been proved totally wrong in what he had told the cabinet and the country. It was the end of appeasement. But the lessons Hitler drew from the summit were even more misguided. He now believed he had the measure of his opponents, telling his generals,
"Our enemies are small worms. I saw them in Munich."
Confident that Britain and France would not fight in September 1939, Hitler overran Poland. But the Führer was mistaken.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us.
The worms had turned, and Hitler would pay the price of a world war that eventually brought about his destruction. In 1945, as the Allies closed in on Berlin and Hitler faced up to inevitable defeat, in his ravings he blamed being enticed into summitry by Chamberlain for what had gone wrong. In the last weeks of his life, Hitler convinced himself that he should have gone to war in September 1938. He fumed that he'd been taken for a ride by that arch-capitalist bourgeois Chamberlain, who flew to the Berghof with his deceptive umbrella in his hand. He talked peace, said Hitler, but he really intended to wage ruthless war against us when he was ready. He railed that Chamberlain's
one and only object in undertaking the trip was to gain time.
The year's grace did allow Britain to develop radar and deploy its new Hurricanes and Spitfires, which were crucial in the Battle of Britain. But that was a byproduct of the talks. Chamberlain's real aim was to avert a devastating war, and here his approach to the summit had been fundamentally misconceived. Germany was simply not capable of delivering a knockout blow on London in 1938. Chamberlain could have called Hitler's bluff. And had he done so, the Führer's house of cards might well have collapsed. Yet while his negotiating stance was overly cautious, I think that Chamberlain did paradoxically make one huge gamble. This careful politician, at the last, staked his entire reputation on the belief that he could do a deal with Adolf Hitler. This tragic mistake haunted the last year of his life. Ravaged by painful and humiliating cancer of the bowel, he died in November 1940. Chamberlain's once towering reputation now lay in ruins. Summitry had made him, and it had broken him. Starting out afraid that Hitler was a madman, he convinced himself that the German dictator was a man of business whose word could be trusted. Aside from this grotesque self-deception was the hubris of believing that he could single-handedly bring peace to Europe. This was a prime minister who acted like a president and paid the price. Neville Chamberlain had risen far higher than his father and his brother, but that also meant that he had much further to fall. Yet, for all his misjudgments, Chamberlain was the pioneer of modern summitry. In the age of the bomber, he believed that diplomacy was too important to be left to the diplomats. Chamberlain blazed the trail that others would follow. Weapons of mass destruction would drive leaders to the summit again and again in the 20th century. In the 20th century, the Summit Conference was reinvented. Air travel allowed statesmen to confront each other on a world stage. Mass media communicated their decisions instantly to a truly global audience. But does summitry make the world a safer place? When leaders meet, the aim is to resolve disputes and ease tension. But sometimes the verbal duel becomes so vicious that it scars the whole relationship. (1961), one of the tensest moments of the Cold War between the superpowers. The Soviet Union seemed to be winning the space race and was widely believed to have opened up a missile gap in nuclear weapons. And the Americans and Soviets were facing off in Berlin, which, it was feared, could be the flashpoint for a catastrophic Third World War. The stakes were therefore immense when John F. Kennedy, the new young American president, met Nikita Khrushchev, the veteran Soviet leader, in Vienna in June 1961. Both men craved international success to silence critics at home. And each was convinced he could achieve what he wanted. These were two huge egos, shot through with vulnerabilities. Vienna exposed the very human frailties of two world leaders. Khrushchev, with his deep inferiority complex and fiery temper that pushed him to posture and score points at every opportunity. Kennedy, a far cry from the youthful icon, still feeling his way into an unfamiliar role, crippled by intense back pain and pumped up by powerful drugs. The result was a massive clash of personalities played out over 2 days. It created profound misunderstandings and, worse, misguided policies, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear destruction over Cuba and dragging America into a war in Vietnam that almost tore the country apart. Vienna in 1961 is a rare case of how jaw can nearly provoke war. It was, I think, the most ill-judged encounter of the Cold War. This is the story of how and why a summit can go horribly wrong. The push for a summit came from a new man in the Kremlin. Nikita Khrushchev was the son of poor peasants from southern Russia. Clever and ambitious, but uneducated, he wanted to become an engineer. But after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, he threw himself into politics. He was party boss in the Ukraine and a political commissar at Stalingrad. He rose rapidly as Stalin's pet. Exuberant, energetic and loyal, but also unthreatening. Not least because at 5'1", he was even shorter than the self-conscious dictator. So it was easy to underestimate this coarse little man with his piggy eyes and ceaseless talk. But after Stalin's death, Khrushchev sidelined one rival after another to become the undisputed leader of his country. Yet behind the bullish exterior, Khrushchev was a complex figure. He was sensitive to any hint of condescension about his lack of culture and education, and unlike Stalin, he found it hard to control his explosive temper, often alternating from effusive good humour to foul-mouthed abuse in a few moments. This was no natural diplomat.
Беснуется лакей империализма, но ничего сделать не может. Как скала стоит наша Родина социалистическая. Yet
Khrushchev was a genuine believer in the potential of communism. He was determined to improve living standards for ordinary Russians. Better food and more consumer goods. But that meant cutting back the costly Soviet military-industrial complex. And that in turn would require diplomacy, a deal to end the arms race with the United States. So Khrushchev's aim was to browbeat the Americans into arms control, which might win him real breathing space for the economy at home. Khrushchev's pressure yielded results, and he was invited to America in September 1959. The Soviet leader was jubilant.
Who would have guessed 20 years ago that the most powerful capitalist country in the world would invite a communist to visit? This is incredible. Today, they have to take us into account. It is our strength that has led to this.
Under pressure from Khrushchev, the West was moving towards a summit. But summitry had been under a cloud throughout the Cold War. Chamberlain's meeting at Munich had become a byword for sellout. The same was true of Churchill and Roosevelt's meeting with Stalin at Yalta in 1945. The lesson seemed to be that it was risky for democracies to talk to dictatorships. The yearning for peace at any price would be too strong. And now, in the 1950s, the American State Department was afraid of what the folksy golfing president Dwight Eisenhower might do if left alone with Khrushchev. But it was hard to ignore the pressures of Western public opinion. During Khrushchev's visit to America, Eisenhower finally agreed to formal talks. But in May 1960, just 2 weeks before the scheduled summit in Paris, the Cold War went critical.
Об этом дне не стоит забывать. Он едва не оказался роковым.
The Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane and captured its pilot. This incursion into Russian airspace increased Soviet suspicions of Western capitalist aggression.
Данные аэрофотосъемки, анализ печатных изданий, дипломатические каналы, данные радиотелефонного перехвата. Ничем не брезгует империалистическая разведка, которую столь откровенно изобразил журнал Newsweek.
To save face, Khrushchev had little choice but to torpedo the summit for which he'd pressed so long. This meant any hope of a breakthrough in East-West relations would have to await a new leader in Washington.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
That you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute.
On the 21st of January 1961, John F. Kennedy delivered his inaugural address in front of the US Capitol. It was a richly symbolic moment. Despite the biting cold, the 43-year-old president was bareheaded, without a topcoat, the very image of youthful vitality.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war.
Kennedy told the world,
"We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty."
But despite what sounded like a clarion call to Cold War confrontation, behind the scenes, Kennedy genuinely wanted dialogue with the Soviets, remarking that
it is far better that we meet at the summit than at the brink.
Unlike many presidents, Kennedy had thought about history. As an undergraduate at Harvard, he wrote a thesis about Chamberlain's negotiations with Hitler. Published in 1940 under the title Why England Slept, it became a bestseller. Contrary to the American stereotype of Chamberlain as a doddering old man who was completely taken in by Hitler, Kennedy argued,
Chamberlain could not have fought even if he'd wanted to. Munich was inevitable, on the grounds of lack of armaments alone.
20 years on, now president, Kennedy remained mindful of that lesson. He believed a democracy could negotiate with a dictatorship, but it had to bargain from a position of strength and a readiness for war. As he put it with a typical rhetorical flourish,
Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
But summitry wasn't just an intellectual issue, it was also intensely personal. Kennedy felt driven to sense out the adversary, and that was rooted in his character and upbringing. John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph, a ruthless multimillionaire, was determined to get his family into the White House. When the eldest son, Joe Jr., was killed in the war, that mantle fell on John, known in the family as Jack. But whereas Joe seemed a natural politician, dynamic, sociable, and easygoing, Jack, his father said later, was rather shy, withdrawn and quiet, and seemed like a budding teacher or writer. So for Jack, climbing the political ladder involved a huge effort. He married well and projected a happy family image. Yet like his father, he carried on numerous affairs in private. Even more damaging for his presidency, and less well known, behind the good looks and athletic manner, the real Jack Kennedy was often virtually a cripple. Since his teens, he'd suffered from ulcers and humiliating diarrhea. The drugs he took for these aggravated a severe adrenal condition known as Addison's disease. He'd had a metal plate inserted in his chronically weak back, and even so, he often couldn't bend to tie his own shoelaces. On top of this, he suffered repeated bladder infections, the result of his promiscuous sex life. Kennedy was in appalling physical condition for a man of his age, but he was also a ferociously determined personality. Instead of being an excuse for a quiet life, his ailments drove him on. And I think it was this personal dimension, as much as any intellectual approach to summitry, that would shape Kennedy's problematic relationship with Khrushchev.
Снова Вашингтон.
The two men had met in 1959, during the Soviet leader's visit to America. It had been a brief encounter, but long enough for Khrushchev to touch a raw nerve when he told Kennedy that he looked too young to be a senator. Kennedy was always sensitive to hints that he lacked gravitas and experience, and the barb stuck. So on becoming president, Kennedy wanted a second round. His Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, thought this would be a risky gamble. Better for the diplomats to do the groundwork, rather than letting the young president tangle so soon with this hardened Soviet leader. But Kennedy had no doubts about his own capacities. He composed a letter to Khrushchev.
I hope it will be possible before too long for us to meet personally for an informal exchange of views.
Khrushchev quickly agreed in principle, clearly pleased that the president shared his desire to get up close and personal. It seemed that Kennedy and Khrushchev's relationship had got off to a good start. But what happened next shifted the power balance between the two countries and decisively affected how each leader read the other. Kennedy's aim was negotiation from strength, but in April 1961, America suddenly seemed pathetically weak. Thanks to Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet Union became the first country to put a man into space. And far worse was to follow.
Behind this change is the story of the betrayal of the Cuban people. It began when Fidel Castro triumphantly entered Havana in 1959 after 6 years of revolt.
The Cuban Revolution of 1959 drove out a corrupt dictatorship dominated by American economic interests. The new Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, then turned to communism and got into bed with Moscow. A further blow to American prestige, taking shape just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Castro had sold out to Premier Khrushchev and the communists.
Kennedy regarded the new Cuba as a tool of Khrushchev's plans to expand communist influence throughout Latin America. But feeling his way in the new job, the president was wary of committing America overtly to toppling Castro. Instead of a conventional invasion by American forces, Kennedy agreed a CIA plan for an operation by Cuban exiles with minimal American support. But landed on the remote Bay of Pigs on the 17th of April, with virtually no air cover, the Cuban exiles crumbled within a couple of days. Kennedy could not conceal the failure or shrug off the blame. Tearfully, he hugged his wife Jackie in the White House bedroom. Acute diarrhea and another urinary tract infection added to his misery. His presidency had been humiliated at the very start, and he must have feared for his hopes of thawing the Cold War. Cuba could have been used by Khrushchev as a pretext for killing off another summit. But for the Soviet leader, there could be no better moment to pressurize a weakened president. In early May, Khrushchev's foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, asked whether Kennedy still wanted a personal meeting, making it clear that the Soviet Union still thought this would be useful. Despite the president's mantra of not negotiating from a position of weakness, he now needed a meeting to improve his international image. Gromyko quickly received a positive response. And through diplomatic back channels, Kennedy signaled he didn't just want an exchange of views, but real progress. Above all, a treaty banning nuclear tests. That didn't interest Khrushchev, but in his astonishment at Kennedy's vacillations over Cuba, he saw a real opportunity to get much more out of the summit. I don't understand Kennedy. What's wrong with him? Can he really be that indecisive? Khrushchev was genuinely perplexed. The president had failed to unleash American power against Castro, and his willingness to talk so soon after the Cuban debacle was a further sign of weakness. Little wonder the Soviet leader felt confident that he could browbeat his opponent into what he wanted, a deal on Berlin. Germany was the great unresolved problem of the Cold War. The country was split in two, and its former capital was now a divided city, marooned inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. But the West would not acknowledge the East German regime run by Walter Ulbricht. If it did this, then it would be accepting the Soviet policy of permanently dividing Germany.
And here is Big Brother himself. The great dictator embraces the little dictator.
Khrushchev wanted a formal peace treaty to end World War II and legally recognize the Ulbricht government. He saw Berlin as vital leverage. Throwing down the gauntlet, Khrushchev threatened that if they did not conclude a German peace treaty, the Soviets would hand over all their rights in Berlin to Ulbricht. That way, if the West wanted to maintain access to its half of Berlin, it would have to come to terms with East Germany. On the face of it, Khrushchev had made a shrewd move. He likened Berlin to the West's testicles. "If I want to make the West scream," he said, "I squeeze on Berlin." Yet the city was also a vulnerable part of the Soviet anatomy, used as a gateway by a flood of refugees from the East German police state. Of the 2.7 million who crossed into West Berlin to seek a better life during the 1950s, most were the young and better educated, whose skills and energy were vital for the communist economy. The Soviet Union had to do something, or its showcase country in Eastern Europe might collapse from within. Khrushchev's aides joked grimly that soon there'd be no one left in the country except Ulbricht and his mistress. So for Khrushchev, Berlin was both a problem and an opportunity. If he could resolve the crisis and the armed standoff in the city by pushing through a treaty, he might be able to realize his long-term goal of reducing the arms burden on the Soviet people. For both sides, Berlin would be the crux of the summit. And yet neither the Soviets nor the Americans came to the table with imaginative ways to resolve it. In all the preparations for the summit, there was a gaping hole at the center. The only top American policymaker who sensed Khrushchev's concern on Berlin was the US ambassador in Moscow, Llewellyn Thompson. He'd been urging Washington to show some flexibility on Germany, but this was very much a minority report. Likewise, most of the Soviet leadership was hawkish and rigid. Only Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan argued for compromise with Kennedy on Germany, rather than backing him into a corner. But, like Thompson, Mikoyan was a lone dove. His doubts, voiced at the last Politburo meeting before the summit, infuriated Khrushchev, who threatened to shoot down any Allied plane trying to land in Berlin. At the end of this stormy meeting, Khrushchev approved a list of gifts for Kennedy and his wife at Vienna. "Presents can be given," he sneered, "even before a war." Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were marching boldly toward the summit, but following very different maps. The world had moved a long way from the days of Hitler and Chamberlain. Communications had been transformed and information was much fuller. Yet the psychological barriers to summitry remained exactly the same. Vienna had been selected as a suitably neutral capital. But after the wobbles of the last few months, the summit had to be organized in just 3 weeks. Khrushchev made his way to the Austrian capital by train through the Eastern Bloc. It was a leisurely journey lasting a week. Kennedy's build-up, by contrast, was hectic. It had begun in mid-May with a state visit to Canada.
Ce voyage est le premier que je fais hors des États-Unis depuis mon élection à la présidence de mon pays.
Kennedy's French accent hadn't been the only disaster. While stooping to plant a ceremonial tree, he'd also put out his fragile back. In private, he had to resort to crutches for the first time in years. Next came a grueling 2-day state visit to Paris, hosted by America's most prickly ally, Charles de Gaulle. To make matters worse, the French crowd seemed more fascinated by his wife. The president felt upstaged, and it rankled.
I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris.
Unknown to all but his innermost circle, the president was by now in excruciating pain from his back. Throughout his European visit, Kennedy tried to ease his problem by taking long, hot baths. The White House doctor administered injections of procaine into his lower back, as well as a heady mixture of assorted drugs to control the other embarrassing problems with his plumbing. But Kennedy had also asked Dr. Max Jacobson, a maverick New York physician, to fly secretly to Paris and Vienna. Jacobson's New York nickname was Dr. Feelgood, and his specialty was amphetamines with which he injected Kennedy daily. Some of the president's entourage thought that Jacobson was a quack, but Kennedy believed that taking speed was the only way to avoid meeting de Gaulle and Khrushchev as a cripple. As he put it, "I don't care if it's horse piss, it works."
This was the scene at Vienna's airport when President Kennedy's plane arrived on the morning of Saturday, June 3rd. The world...
It was raining when the Kennedys finally flew into Vienna on the morning of the summit itself. Kennedy cannot have been relaxed in mind or body. By the time he arrived at the American ambassador's residence, the venue for day one of the summit, it was well afternoon. Khrushchev was due at 12:45. There was just time for Dr. Jacobson to administer a quick injection. As the Soviet motorcade drew up, Kennedy, tanked up by excitement and no doubt by the drugs, strode down the steps, apparently in the pink of health. The portly Khrushchev, aged 67 to the president's 43, came up to his nose. Posing for the press, the two men joked awkwardly about their age difference. Khrushchev irritated Kennedy by recalling that in 1959 he'd heard of him as a promising young politician. Kennedy had not forgotten the apparent snub. The first day of meetings would take place in the music room, overlooking the garden. The two leaders sat on opposite sides of a coffee table, with an interpreter and their closest advisors. The duel had begun. Khrushchev quickly seized the initiative. The United States must recognize that communism exists and has won its right to develop. Kennedy hit back. The Soviet Union is trying to eliminate free governments allied to the United States. That is a matter of very serious concern to Americans. Kennedy should have cut out the rhetoric and got down to substance. Instead, he was getting sucked into an ideological argument. A very bad mistake. Through long diatribes that became even more ponderous in translation, Khrushchev hammered on about how communism would triumph not by force of arms, but as a law of historical development. Just as capitalism had challenged feudalism, so communism was now challenging capitalism. We cannot regard all this as historical inevitability, was Kennedy's riposte. People must have free choice. Khrushchev struck back, comparing Kennedy's stance to that of the Spanish Inquisition. The United States wants to build a dam, blocking the development of the human mind and conscience. Ignoring the stinging accusation, Kennedy warned that a confrontation could get completely out of hand in the nuclear age. But the word he used to make his point, miscalculation, didn't work. To the Soviet leader, this sounded appallingly patronizing. Khrushchev exploded. A very vague word. And was the Soviet Union supposed to sit like a schoolboy with his hands on his desk? Over a lunch of coquille de foie gras and beef Wellington, washed down with 3 fine wines, the conversation lightened up, and the president at last managed to score a few points. When asked about the array of medals on his jacket, Khrushchev gestured with his chin. "This one is Lenin Peace Prize." "I hope you get to keep it," Kennedy shot back. Or so his press office quickly told reporters. With his charismatic manner and nifty spin doctors, Kennedy was up on points in the PR battle. But in private, the story was very different. "Is it always like this?" Kennedy asked Ambassador Thompson during the lunch break. "Par for the course," was the reply. But privately, Thompson was shaken that the president seemed to be taking one hit after another from the Soviet leader. In an effort at rational discussion, Kennedy had been pushed on the defensive in an ideological punch-up. For his part, Khrushchev had seen nothing to change his perception of Kennedy's weakness. His disdain for his opponent was, I think, rooted in his experience as a father. He once said, "Kennedy is as young as my son would be had he lived." It was a revealing aside. Leonid, Khrushchev's eldest son, was born like John Kennedy in 1917. A daredevil Air Force pilot during World War II, he was finally shot down and killed in 1943. His father, however, rarely talked about it. Perhaps from grief, but more likely because Leonid's pre-war life had been a decadent chronicle of drink and debauchery. So much so that in 1937, Khrushchev evicted him from the household. For the Soviet leader to compare Kennedy to Leonid was hardly a compliment. He must have known from KGB reports that Kennedy was likewise an inveterate womanizer. If Khrushchev saw his own son across the table from him in Vienna, little wonder he found it hard to take the young president seriously. After a stroll in the garden, the two men returned to the music room, this time alone except for interpreters. Possibly Kennedy thought Khrushchev might be more tractable away from his entourage. If so, it didn't work. Instead of moving on to specifics such as Germany or nuclear test bans, the president most unwisely said he wanted to come back to the general thesis about historical change. Kennedy wanted to contest the same muddy ground that they had trodden before lunch. Perhaps he wasn't thinking clearly because of the pain and the drugs. Or maybe he just couldn't resist an intellectual argument, particularly when he'd lost the first round. So Kennedy warned Khrushchev that Soviet support for wars of national liberation could easily escalate into a general crisis through miscalculation. This time, Khrushchev did not flare up, but deflected Kennedy's point to his advantage. The president seems to believe that when people rise up against tyrants, that is the result of Moscow's activities. But this is not so. In Iran, Khrushchev asserted, the people are so poor that the country has become a volcano and changes are bound to occur sooner or later. By supporting the Shah, the United States generated hostility towards itself and favorable feelings towards the Soviet Union. This, he said, was what had already happened in Cuba. The United States was supporting old, moribund, reactionary regimes against the people's struggle for freedom. He jumped around the world to keep making his point, citing the Congo, Angola, Algeria. It was a brilliant series of palpable hits. Kennedy was on the back foot, and Khrushchev kept him there. The afternoon meeting ended bleakly after 3.5 hours. For the Americans, the lack of preparation was proving fatal. Rather like Chamberlain in the face of Hitler's ranting, Kennedy was knocked off balance by his opponent's calculated aggression. Thompson regretted later that the Americans hadn't worked out any very clear scenario in advance for the discussions. As for Khrushchev, according to his aide Oleg Troyanovsky, he returned from the first day puffed up with his performance against the urbane Harvard graduate, exclaiming,
"This man is very inexperienced, even immature."
Both leaders must have been tired as the talks finished late. Kennedy in particular was in acute pain from his back. But there was only a short time for a hot bath before the car whisked him off to the Schönbrunn Palace. The leaders and their wives were guests of honor at a formal dinner hosted by the Austrian president. Khrushchev stole the show by turning up in a business suit rather than bourgeois black tie. Kennedy arrived late and was not on best form. At one point, he nearly sat on Mrs. Khrushchev's substantial lap when she changed seats, rather suddenly. The Soviet leader spent most of the evening chatting up Jackie Kennedy, alternating between far-fetched anecdotes and long recitations of Soviet achievements. "Oh, Mr. Chairman," she finally exclaimed, "don't bore me with statistics." The next morning, the Kennedys attended 9 o'clock Mass at St. Stephen's Cathedral, while Khrushchev laid a wreath at the Soviet War Memorial. For both, it should have been a sobering reminder of the larger goal for which they had journeyed to the summit. But the only war they now seemed to be focusing on was their own personal duel. The summit resumed at 10:15 at the Grand Soviet Embassy on Reisnerstrasse. After the impasse of the previous evening, you might have expected each man to review tactics. But instead, they stuck doggedly to their guns. Kennedy's tone was still one of firm but rational discussion, seeking to explain and justify American policy. Khrushchev, tanked up by his success on day one, kept scoring debating points. They now reached what Kennedy privately called the Nutcracker, Berlin. But the president had come with no new proposals. He simply sat tight on the status quo. All his advisors at home had urged him to do this, and now the need was more pressing because of his ineffective performance on the previous day. As the two men circled around each other, their language became more and more extreme. Khrushchev went on the attack. Hitler said that Germany needed living space up to the Urals, and now some of Hitler's generals are top commanders in NATO. Khrushchev then mentioned the 20 million Soviet dead from World War II, one of whom, he added cryptically, was his own son. Mikoyan, he said, had also lost a son, and Gromyko 2 brothers. The president said quietly that he too had lost a brother in the war. There was a moment of reflection on both sides. Khrushchev acknowledged that American mothers mourned their sons just as deeply as Soviet mothers, but he couldn't resist another dig, noting that the American death toll was only 350,000. Frustrated and emotional, the two men began to talk about open conflict. If America wants war over Germany, Khrushchev postured, let it be so. Kennedy cut back. If you sign a peace treaty with East Germany that denies us our rights, that would be an act of war. We will go ahead and sign such a treaty, Khrushchev declared. And on that cliffhanger, the two sides adjourned for lunch. Determined not to be outdone, the Soviets had laid on an even grander spread than the Americans. A feast of caviar, fish pie, chicken and ice cream, washed down by 4 choice wines. Officially, lunch was the last act of the summit. But Kennedy wanted one more round, desperate to convince Khrushchev that he was playing with fire. So he asked for a few words in private. I have gained the impression, said Kennedy, that the Soviet Union is presenting me with the alternative of having to accept its position on Berlin or having a face-to-face confrontation. If America wants war, that's its problem, Khrushchev shot back. It's not the Soviet Union that threatens war. It's the United States. I'm not the one trying to force through a change. Our decision to sign a peace treaty is irrevocable. We shall do so in December if there's no agreement. The President concluded the conversation by observing that it would be a cold winter. It's clear that Kennedy was shaken by the whole experience. His firm but pragmatic approach had failed. He hadn't risen above the bluster or ideological posturing. When he poured out his experiences next day to Harold Macmillan in London, the British Prime Minister thought it sounded like Chamberlain trying to hold a conversation with Hitler. To an American journalist, the President confided that it was
roughest thing in my life. He just beat the hell out of me, so I've got a terrible problem. If he thinks I'm inexperienced and have no guts, until we remove those ideas, we won't get anywhere with it.
After returning to the United States, Kennedy was forced to take a complete rest in Florida, and his press office finally admitted that the President was on crutches. As he had dreaded, this news added to the general perception of weakness. By contrast, Khrushchev was in great form. One veteran Western reporter in Moscow said he looked more exuberant and relaxed than in years. The Central Committee praised him for conducting the Vienna talks with great skill and in an aggressive spirit. Each leader read the summit very differently. Khrushchev, with ego inflated, was confirmed in his contempt for Kennedy. The President felt he had to react extravagantly to rebuild his credibility. What each man did next took the world into the darkest moments of the Cold War. While Kennedy was recuperating in Florida, Soviet warnings left no doubt that the situation in Berlin was building to a crisis. The Berlin escape hatch for refugees was clearly going to be closed. But how this would be done, and whether violence would ensue, were less evident. Kennedy knew that after botching the Bay of Pigs, he couldn't afford another mistake. Yet the possible cost of standing firm appalled him. The Pentagon estimated that 70 million Americans, nearly half the nation, would die in an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviets. So Kennedy dismissed hardline advice for a military confrontation over Berlin, but he knew he had to find another way to win this battle of wills with Khrushchev. Still on crutches, he hobbled to the Oval Office on the evening of the 25th of July to speak over radio and television to the American people.
West Berlin has now become, as never before, the great testing place of Western courage and will, for we cannot separate its safety from our own.
He announced another $3 billion for the armed forces, and he declared,
"We seek peace, but we shall not surrender. That is the central meaning of this crisis and the meaning of this government's policy."
The speech was acclaimed at home. After weeks of drift, Kennedy had reasserted American will and leadership. More important, it seems to have rattled Khrushchev. The East German leader, Walter Ulbricht, had wanted a military takeover of West Berlin. But Khrushchev now felt this was too dangerous. He gave Ulbricht the go-ahead to seal East Berlin from West Berlin, but warned him to start with barbed wire, monitoring the Western reaction before proceeding to a concrete wall. There was outrage in West Germany, but silence from the White House. The President, like his advisors, was surprised yet relieved by the Soviet solution. Kennedy joked privately that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. For the President, this was something of a recovery after the setbacks of Vienna. For the West, the Berlin Wall became a propaganda triumph, graphically illustrating that communists did not live in a free society. Khrushchev had momentarily lost his nerve. He'd backed away from a direct military confrontation. But he still rated Kennedy on the same level as his no-good son Leonid. Increasingly desperate for a big score in the Cold War, Khrushchev decided to stake all on a gambler's throw.
The new intelligence photos are in, and now the evidence is unmistakable. It shows Russian IL-28 Beagle bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons, and it shows more offensive ballistic missiles being emplaced.
He installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, within easy striking distance of America's eastern seaboard.
All of the Western Hemisphere, from Hudson Bay to Lima, Peru, is within their range.
Khrushchev called it throwing a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants. The idea didn't take shape until the spring of 1962, but it was rooted in the Vienna summit and his reading of Kennedy.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination.
The Cuban Missile Crisis took the world to the brink of nuclear war. This was precisely the danger Kennedy had tried to warn against when he talked about miscalculation. As over Berlin, Kennedy struck a balance between firmness and provocation. Despite pressure from the military hawks, he rejected airstrikes on Cuba and instead imposed a blockade on the island.
It was the Soviet Union's turn to call the next move. Soviet ships approaching Cuba knew the United States Navy had orders to intercept them.
This gave Khrushchev time to rethink. Deep down, he knew that his bluff had been called. If it came to nuclear war, the Soviet arsenal was far inferior to that of the Americans. After a palpitating face-off, he decided to remove the missiles. The superpowers had been eyeball to eyeball, and Moscow blinked first. Only then, according to one of Khrushchev's closest aides, did the Soviet leader stop doubting his adversary's will and intellect. But it was too late. Humiliated in the missile crisis, Khrushchev was ousted in a Kremlin coup in October 1964 and carefully airbrushed out of recent Soviet history. But at least it had been a peaceful transition. Khrushchev reflected wryly that if someone had told Stalin to resign, not even a wet spot would have remained where he'd been standing. But Vienna led to miscalculation on the American side as well. During an interview with one journalist immediately after the summit, Kennedy talked of the need to prove American toughness as a superpower.
We have a problem in trying to make our power credible. Vietnam looks like the place.
In Vietnam, like Germany, a country divided by the Cold War, the US had been providing financial aid to the pro-American South. But now Kennedy decided to take a firm stand against communist insurgents. Determined to prove after Vienna that this president would not be pushed around, he greatly increased America's commitments, sending in a total of 16,000 military advisors. He could see the risks of being sucked in, but felt he had no choice but to draw the Cold War line in Vietnam.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by just a moment, please. Something has happened.
By the time of his assassination in November 1963, gunned down by a communist sympathizer in Dallas, Kennedy had set up the conditions for America's longest and most traumatic war, in which more than 50,000 Americans died before South Vietnam fell to the communists. Vienna should never have happened. The problem wasn't a missile gap, it was a personality gap. Kennedy and Khrushchev each constructed his own mistaken image of the other. Their disastrous duel poisoned superpower relations and nearly sparked World War III. This was a summit that cast a long shadow. Meeting face to face can often be a turn-off. But occasionally, when you really look the other person in the eye, it can change them. In fact, it can also change you. When this happens at the summit, it sometimes begins a process of lasting historical change. What really matters is the chemistry between the leaders. The Cold War could easily have ended in World War III. Yet in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to cut their nuclear arsenals, and the Red Army withdrew peacefully from Eastern Europe. This extraordinary turnaround is often portrayed as the inevitable result of vast historical forces, especially the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. Yet I believe that the pace of the transition and its peaceful nature cannot be explained without understanding the interplay of personalities at the very top. And that all started here on Lake Geneva in November 1985, when two leaders, despite their bitterly opposed ideologies, somehow clicked. What went on behind the scenes when Mikhail Gorbachev met Ronald Reagan in Geneva reveals, I think, a reality at odds with popular misperceptions of these two leaders. Reagan was a notorious Cold Warrior, hated by the European left. Yet Summitry brought out the ardent peacemaker deep within him. Gorbachev, on the other hand, was no messiah, as so often painted in the liberal West. He didn't come to Geneva with much new thinking. Real change in Soviet attitudes happened as Gorbachev gained confidence in Reagan. But success is not achieved by statesmen who think they can do it all on their own. At Geneva, it was teamwork with and between advisors that turned a chemical bond into a chain reaction. This time, against all the odds, Summitry worked. This is the story of how the Cold War ended, not with a bang or a whimper, but a handshake. Summits are often disastrous. They can be bedeviled by illusion, as with Neville Chamberlain in 1938.
This will be the critical day in their talks. Mr. Khrushchev is expected to raise the question of Berlin and disarmament.
Or end in recrimination, as with Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961. And there was no reason to think that Geneva in 1985 would be any different. Each leader arrived with entrenched ideological convictions and real doubts about the other.
Heart of gold. Yes, he's got a great big heart of gold.
In 1981, America's new Republican president had ridden into town.
This is a man whose time has come, a man whose principles have been familiar to Americans for 30 years.
There seemed nothing subtle about Ronald Reagan. A B-movie actor, he'd made his political name as a relentless commie basher. In his very first press conference as president, he struck a belligerent note towards the Soviets.
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat.
2 years later, Reagan famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
It seemed that the Cold War was getting hot. Reagan was reviled by the peace movement. Yet he was, I believe, in his own way, just as much of a peacenik. His was a complex personality. To understand Reagan, I think we have to appreciate that this fervent Cold Warrior also hated the bomb. Reagan believed that the Cold War policy of deterrence, based on mutually assured destruction, acronym MAD, was true madness. Close advisors doubted that he would have been willing to launch America's nuclear weapons even if the country were under attack. Reagan had been raised an evangelical Protestant with a profound sense of good and evil. His faith, though private, ran deep. And it was strengthened by what happened to him barely 2 months into his presidency.
President Reagan has been shot and wounded in an assassination attempt in Washington.
I wasn't there, but there were apparently 3 persons shot, and all I know on that is what I heard, what I got off the wire.
Well, as best we know, he's had 1 round into his body, in the left side.
1 bullet lodged an inch from his heart. His life was saved only because of quick action by the Secret Service and by surgeons in a nearby hospital. Reagan's quip on the operating table has gone down in American folklore. Please tell me you're Republicans. Afterwards, Reagan brooded over why God had spared him, eventually concluding it was to fulfill a providential mission, to leave the world a safer place. Reagan wanted to replace mutually assured destruction with mutual survival. He announced on nationwide TV a new project, truly his own idea, that he claimed would render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The White House called this multi-billion-dollar project the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. But critics doubted Reagan's sincerity and claimed SDI threatened to escalate the arms race into space. Star Wars was the label that stuck. And the fear in Moscow was that if America's missile shield worked, the US could mount a nuclear strike on what Reagan regarded as the evil empire without fear of retaliation. Here was the central paradox of the Reagan presidency. On the one hand, the fierce Cold Warrior, on the other, the would-be crusader for peace. The Soviets found it hard to decide which was the real Reagan. And that was understandable, because the president never resolved the confusion himself. Barely a year after pledging to make nuclear missiles obsolete, Reagan made an infamous gaffe while testing a radio microphone.
All right, my fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
But Reagan's rhetoric wasn't the only reason why summitry was slow to get going.
Police had warned the demonstrators in Warsaw not to come onto the streets, but some 10,000 of them ignored the warning.
From the mountains of Afghanistan to the cities of Poland, the Soviets were still waging the Cold War. And the Soviet leadership, I think, was just not quite up to summit diplomacy. Leonid Brezhnev was now on his last legs, senile and incompetent. The man seemed like a metaphor for his ailing, bureaucratic regime. The so-called era of stagnation was the butt of many secret Russian jokes. In one of them, Brezhnev greets Mrs. Thatcher on her arrival in Moscow. Picking up his prompt card, he reads, "We welcome you, Mrs. Gandhi." And he nudges him. "Mrs. Thatcher." Brezhnev glares. "We welcome you, Mrs. Gandhi." "Leonid Ilyich, she is not Mrs. Gandhi. She is Mrs. Thatcher." "You fool. I know that she is Mrs. Thatcher. But it says here Mrs. Gandhi." Brezhnev finally expired in November 1982. Reagan's hopes for a summit rose with the appointment of Yuri Andropov, a former head of the KGB, but also known as a would-be reformer. Yet Andropov died in February 1984. He'd been desperately ill with kidney failure. After his second Soviet state funeral in only 15 months, Vice President George Bush joked to US Embassy staff, "See you again, same time, next year." He was mistaken, but only by 1 month. The Soviet old guard had chosen as their next leader another geriatric, Konstantin Chernenko. Sure enough, Chernenko wheezed his way into the grave in March 1985. But it wasn't just the rapid turnover at the top and the distraction of planning state funerals that prevented summitry. The old men shared an old paranoia. They never forgot being invaded out of the blue by Hitler in 1941. The epic conflict cost 28 million dead. That's 1 in 7 of the pre-war population. That generation of Soviet leaders carried over the fear of surprise attack to the era of nuclear weapons and to a new enemy, the United States.
It was just before 9 o'clock as the plane bringing the first cruise missiles to Britain came into land at the end of its overnight flight across the Atlantic. A long crate was slid out of the back doors. It was the right length to accommodate crews. The missiles had arrived.
The Politburo's anxiety peaked in November 1983. Rattled by new cruise and Pershing missile deployments in Western Europe and by Reagan's strong language, the Kremlin misinterpreted a NATO exercise as a sign that American bases had been placed on full alert. Reagan was depicted in the Russian media as the man willing and able to push the nuclear button, even as a modern-day Hitler.
When Reagan learned all this, he was genuinely shocked. For years, he'd been saying that the Soviets would stop at nothing, even war, to achieve their ends. Now he discovered that apparently they believed exactly the same about him.
With a new sense of Russians as fellow human beings, Reagan made a conciliatory broadcast that was a major departure.
The fact that neither of us likes the other system is no reason to refuse to talk. Living in this nuclear age makes it imperative that we do talk. Just suppose with me for a moment that an Ivan and an Anya could find themselves, say, in a waiting room or sharing a shelter from the rain or a storm with a Jim and Sally, and there was no language barrier to keep them from getting acquainted. Would they then debate the differences between their respective governments? Or would they find themselves comparing notes about their children and what each other did for a living?
By the time this almost schizoid president started his second term in January 1985, the peacemaker was in the ascendant.
I think that's just been arranged.
And after Chernenko's death, Reagan finally had someone to talk to in Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev was born in 1931, making him 30 years younger than Chernenko. With a different generation came a different mindset.
Обладающего выдающимися политическими и организаторскими способностями, громадным жизненным опытом.
Gorbachev was a member of the educated middle class that emerged under Nikita Khrushchev's reforms. A graduate in law from Moscow State University, he had risen rapidly within the Communist Party. and pioneered reform of Russia's collective farms. Like Khrushchev, Gorbachev was sure that the Soviet system needed radical change. But there was a crucial difference. Unlike Khrushchev, he believed that communism had to evolve into something more like Western social democracy. Gorbachev was clever, confident and articulate. A far cry from his predecessors. And with a wife to match. The chic and intellectual Raisa, gushed Western journalists, was the first Soviet leader's wife to weigh less than her husband. Margaret Thatcher was the first Western leader to be captivated by the Gorbachev magic when he visited London as Deputy General Secretary in December 1984.
I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together.
At Camp David, a few days later, Thatcher's briefing on this unusual Russian encouraged Reagan to propose a summit in Washington. Immediately, Gorbachev became Soviet leader. But getting to the summit would be heavy going. Like Reagan, Gorbachev was a complex character. He still believed profoundly in the basics of the communist faith. His goal was to remove the grim legacies of Stalinism and get back to what he characterized as the pure idealism of Lenin. Gorbachev's advisors also suspected that Reagan's invitation was simply propaganda by this Jekyll and Hyde Cold Warrior to wrong-foot his critics. Reagan had cried wolf too often to be taken seriously as a dove. Back in Washington, Gorbachev's hesitation played into the hands of hardliners. Reagan's split personality was reflected in his divided administration. Caspar Weinberger at Defense was skeptical of every Russian move. This vehement hawk didn't want a summit. If it had to happen, he wanted Gorbachev to come crawling, cap in hand, to the White House. But there were doves in Washington as well. Reagan's actress wife, Nancy, had devoted her life to Ronnie and was keen to dispel his image as a ruthless Cold Warrior. But pillow talk doesn't get you to the summit. Reagan needed a practical policymaker to help him turn dreams into reality, and a strong manager to resolve the battles within his cabinet. The man who took on these roles was his Secretary of State, George Shultz, a Washington heavyweight. Shultz looked like a kind of doleful bloodhound, but appearances were deceptive. A veteran of Nixon's cabinet, he knew how to survive in the Washington jungle. He was an academic economist, comfortable with big ideas, and as an experienced labor negotiator, he could haggle with the best and the worst of them. Shultz now persuaded Reagan to ignore the hawk's objections, and he convinced the Kremlin that America was serious about better relations. But, like Reagan, Gorbachev was operating within a dysfunctional team. The big obstacle to better relations with America was the foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko. A veteran of the Khrushchev era, Grim Grom, as he was known in the West, had been Gorbachev's kingmaker, and he warned Shultz that Gorbachev had a nice smile, but iron teeth. Yet he was the first to feel the new leader's bite. He was out within months. Gromyko was replaced by a virtual unknown with no diplomatic experience. Eduard Shevardnadze was a Reformist Party boss who had rooted out corruption in his native Georgia. Now he was phoned out of the blue by Gorbachev and summoned to Moscow. It was a breathtaking change, and clear proof of Gorbachev's personal power.
The new leader recognized that he could not transform relations with the West as long as Gromyko was in charge. He needed a committed reformer loyal to himself. And being virtually an enlightened despot under the Soviet system, he could redirect policy in ways that Reagan and Schultz could only dream of.
Shevardnadze proved a quick learner, and he soon forged a good working relationship with Schultz, his opposite number. The two sides agreed that Reagan and Gorbachev would meet in Geneva in November 1985. But was there anything for them to talk about? The media was profoundly skeptical. The key problem was Star Wars. Gorbachev himself warned that if the US didn't change its policy, Geneva would be pointless. But if America did abandon its plans for missile defense, he said the superpowers could cut their nuclear arsenals by half. There seemed little chance of a deal. The Washington hawks and doves were still battling it out for the ear of the president. Schultz managed to stop Weinberger going to Geneva, but Weinberger found a way to strike back. Weinberger wrote to the president, advising him to make no concessions on SDI or arms control. And his letter was leaked to the press. White House aides fumed that the defense secretary was trying to sabotage the summit. Successful summitry requires teamwork. The feuding undermined American diplomacy and sent signals to Gorbachev that Reagan wasn't serious. All in all, the omens for the summit did not look good. The American party flew into Geneva on Saturday the 16th of November, a full 2 days before the Soviets arrived. The president needed plenty of time to recover from jet lag. Reagan was 74, a full 20 years older than Gorbachev. And in July, he'd undergone an operation to remove a cancerous growth in his bowel. First encounters at the summit always generate a keen sense of anticipation. The mood before Geneva was rather like the hype when two heavyweight boxers square up for the big fight, and the world's press was speculating that Reagan was about to meet his match. The Soviet leader was clearly sharp and dynamic, and he was already charming public opinion across Western Europe.
I had trouble. Both of us had trouble getting this.
Reagan had been dubbed the Great Communicator because of his command of the conversational set-piece speech. But he was known to have a short attention span and to be fuzzy on detail. Alarmed by his reliance on slogans when speaking about the Soviets, his aides had subjected the president to what they jokingly called Soviet Union 101, the equivalent of an introductory university course about the country. He wrote in his diary,
"Lord, I hope I'm ready and not overtrained."
He and his team even secretly rehearsed summit scenarios.
Before we get started, can I say something about this? I would not want, under any circumstances, that any of us mention to the press in any shape or fashion that we rehearsed the president today or that he went through play acting with somebody taking the part of Gorbachev. That's the last thing in the world we need out in the press. So, for heaven's sakes, keep it in this room, please.
Would Gorbachev and his chic intellectual wife upstage the senior citizens from Hollywood? The world's media was obsessed with these questions. And even among Reagan's entourage, there were frissons of anxiety about how the meetings would go.
Well, I tell you, I read the clips this morning, and particularly the Washington Post, and as far as I'm concerned, they're for Gorbachev. So no natural like that on our side.
They might have chosen sides.
Nope.
Day one of the summit took place at Fleur d'Eau, a secluded lakeside chateau chosen by the Americans. Reagan arrived early, ready to welcome Gorbachev at 10 o'clock. He paced around the entrance hall, keeping his overcoat on for warmth. Then, as the Soviet limo screeched to a halt outside, he took off his coat and strode out into the cold. The two leaders shook hands warmly, but what struck the world media was the image of Gorbachev muffled in coat and scarf, and Reagan looking, if anything, like his junior, a picture of vigour in his elegant suit. Through gritted teeth, Gorbachev kept smiling for the cameras, but he knew that the president had won the first round in their PR battle. Yet White House staff could breathe a sigh of relief. Whatever Reagan's stage nerves beforehand, it's clear that the old actor knew how to turn in a performance when it really mattered.
I just was sleeping when I decided to work in my session. Then I think that both the president and myself have good grounds to believe that it's a story.
After innumerable media photos, Reagan ushered Gorbachev into a side room. There, accompanied only by an interpreter on each side, the two leaders had their first chance to size each other up. This chat was intended to last only 15 minutes, but it ran on and on. White House staff began to get anxious. After 40 minutes, the president's assistant, Jim Kuhn, asked Schultz if perhaps he should go in and try to move things on. "If you're dumb enough to do that," the Secretary of State barked back, "you shouldn't be in your job."
Your meeting has been going on much longer than planned. Why?
Because whoever was scheduling didn't allow enough time.
The first plenary session finally started at 11:30. The two sides sat opposite each other, wall on wall as the American diplomats called it, at a long oval table, flown in specially from the UN in New York. Gorbachev wanted to set out the big issues. Reagan wanted to deal with the mutual suspicions that needed to be overcome first. Overall, the language was polite and restrained. Even so, the president got in a few digs. Maybe the Soviet Union doesn't want war, but it seems to want to get its own way. Gorbachev was not impressed. He told his advisors afterwards, "This man is a dinosaur." Each side took lunch separately, so as to fine-tune their tactics for the afternoon's talks, which would address the controversial American development of SDI, the anti-missile shield in space. Now Gorbachev took the gloves off. He denounced America's primitive approach to world problems. He ridiculed Reagan's claims about a Soviet arms buildup, insisting that the United States had far more nuclear weapons. It was Reagan's turn. He said that Gorbachev's presentation illustrated the lack of trust between them. Leafing through his prompt cards, he reeled off one example after another of Soviet double-dealing, from World War II to the invasion of Afghanistan. Gorbachev said later that the transcript read like number one communist and number one imperialist trying to out-argue each other. The atmosphere was getting hot. It was rather like Kennedy and Khrushchev trading accusations in Vienna nearly a quarter of a century before. But Geneva proved very different from Vienna. Suddenly, Reagan defused the tension by suggesting that they take a walk outside. The American team had planned this beforehand for just such a moment. Gorbachev readily accepted, though remember in the morning he wouldn't put on his overcoat until he was sure that the president was going to do the same. Outside, they chatted about Reagan's Hollywood years. The president joked, "I didn't just make B-movies, I made a few good ones." Gorbachev said that he'd recently seen the film King's Row and liked it very much. This was a shrewd move, because Reagan considered that his best movie, famous for his line on discovering that both his legs had been amputated, "Where's the rest of me?" The two men strolled down to a pool house by the lake. This now derelict outbuilding was the venue for what Reagan dubbed the Fireside Summit. The president handed Gorbachev a translation of the latest American arms control proposal, and they quickly got back to the Missile Defense Initiative. The Soviet leader hammered away at the folly of space weapons. Reagan kept insisting that SDI was purely defensive. Gorbachev came back at him with real emotion. What, he asked, was the logic of starting an arms race in a new arena? This got Reagan onto his favourite image of the spear and the shield. The president insisted they should seek to rid the world of the nuclear threat, but retain a shield just in case there was an unforeseen return to nuclear missiles. Gorbachev said he could understand the president's feelings at a human level. The idea of strategic defence had clearly captured the president's imagination. But, speaking as a political leader, Gorbachev said he couldn't possibly agree. America, he went on, could launch its nuclear spear and then use its shield as protection when the Soviets threw their spear in retaliation. In other words, America would be in a position to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union. Before the meeting, when Schultz warned Reagan that Gorbachev would mount an all-out attack on SDI, the president wrote in his diary, "Well, this will be a case of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object." But instead of letting an ideological collision break up another summit, the two leaders now pulled back. They simply agreed to talk another day. Afterwards, Gorbachev talked about having another summit, so Reagan invited him to come to Washington. Gorbachev accepted and suggested a return visit to Moscow. Reagan's advisors were astonished when the president announced that they'd already fixed up another summit. He ribbed Schultz about his diplomatic coup for weeks. On the gravel, they shook hands and looked each other in the eye. The chemistry was palpable. At the first session, Gorbachev told his aides, he saw only blank, uncomprehending eyes as the president mumbled certain banalities from his paper. But as the day went on, he began to discern another Reagan. In the pool house, he said, they'd managed to engage in a genuinely human conversation. The president, for his part, enjoyed the Soviet leader's passion and animation. Reagan told hardline staff,
"I can't just keep poking him in the eye. You could almost get to like the guy. I keep telling myself I mustn't do it because he could turn."
Their growing rapport was strengthened that evening at a dinner hosted by the Soviets. But the same could not be said of their wives. Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev were the proverbial chalk and cheese. An ex-Hollywood starlet obsessed by astrology and a PhD in sociology who lectured about Marxism-Leninism. Lectured was in fact the operative word about Raisa.
Nancy found it hard to get a word in edgeways, and she was no shrinking violet. Afterwards, Nancy exploded in fury. Who does that dame think she is?
On day 2, the venue shifted to the Soviet mission. Before the plenary session, the two leaders had another one-on-one.
Is he tough? How are his teeth? Are they iron?
And this time, the ideological Reagan was uppermost. He struck a hawkish line on human rights, to the irritation of Gorbachev, who considered it largely propaganda.
The atmosphere was noticeably less cordial. This was the morning after the night before, and neither man was at his best. Reagan had drunk too much coffee for breakfast and was feeling distinctly uncomfortable. The meeting dragged on for 70 minutes. By the time it ended, both men were in a bad mood.
The next session soon came back to the crunch issue, missile defense, SDI. Gorbachev again warned about an arms race in space. Reagan insisted that he was only talking about research and he would share the results.
It was the same clash as the day before. But this time there was no respite, no walk to the pool house. They just kept slugging it out. And the talks, which had begun irritably, became ever more heated. Gorbachev, a charmer in public, could flare up angrily in private. Why don't you believe me, he demanded, when I say that the Soviet Union will never attack? Reagan started to respond. Please answer me, Mr. President. What is your answer? And again, before Reagan could get going, I want an answer. Why don't you believe me? Finally, Reagan got a word in. Look, he said, no one can tell the American people they should rely on personal faith rather than sound defense. It was a forceful point. Gorbachev shifted ground. Why should I believe that you mean what you say about sharing SDI research, when you don't even share your advanced technology with your own allies? Let's be more realistic.
Once again, he went over the Soviet offer. Deep cuts in nuclear arsenals if the United States would abandon the Firebird of missile defense. They had locked horns. There was a long silence.
Maybe for 30 seconds, the two men stared, red-faced, at each other. Then Gorbachev threw down his pencil, flung up his arms and said, Mr. President, I don't agree with you, but I can see that you really mean it. He added quietly, maybe this has all grown a little bit heated. I was just trying to convey to you our concern about SDI. This was an extraordinary moment. On the face of it, a tactical victory for Reagan. But at a deeper level, I think that Gorbachev had shown imaginative leadership. He deliberately backed down in order to allow the larger dialogue to continue.
Elsewhere in the Soviet mission, the two wives were enduring another tea party.
By the time we were going to party, it seemed to me that we have been knowing each other for 100 years.
Nancy was puzzled by the usually glamorous Raisa's severe outfit. But this was the only session that would be photographed for Soviet consumption. Raisa had dressed in the garb of a Russian teacher to avoid inflaming criticism back home of her bourgeois affectations. At dinner that evening at Reagan's residence, the atmosphere between the two leaders was convivial.
Okay, hold back there, Scotty. Nobody's going anywhere yet.
Reagan said that he and Gorbachev were meeting for the first time at this level and therefore had little practice. But having read the history of previous summits, he'd concluded that earlier leaders hadn't accomplished very much. With Gorbachev nodding in agreement, Reagan suggested that the two of them should simply say, "To hell with the past. We'll do it our way and get something done.
So what had been achieved? The main thing, I believe, was the very real chemistry between the leaders, despite their major differences on policy.
Unlike Khrushchev and Kennedy, these leaders had moved beyond one-upmanship, point-scoring and rhetoric, and they were determined to continue negotiating. There were also other, less eye-catching developments fixed up by Shevardnadze and Schultz. Cultural and educational exchanges involving scientists, teachers and sports teams.
It's true that nothing had been decided on the vital questions of arms control. But the success of summits can be measured in their symbolism as well as their substance. The visible rapport between the two leaders created a profound shift in public perceptions, building confidence between East and West. This was summitry as a truly humanizing force.
So here, on Lake Geneva, superpower relations began to thaw. But there were to be no quick, easy successes. It had been agreed that Geneva was not to be a one-off summit. But the Soviet leader was unwilling to go to Washington until Reagan promised an arms control agreement that included SDI. Yet the president would not give up on research into weapons in space. The good vibes began to fade. In desperation, Gorbachev suggested another quick meeting at Reykjavik in Iceland in October 1986 to see if he and Reagan could hammer out common guidelines for their arms control negotiators. Gorbachev now offered much deeper cuts in nuclear weapons.
Reykjavik was a dramatic moment. Both leaders got carried away with schemes for radical disarmament, even talking about eliminating all nuclear weapons within 10 years. But the high hopes proved illusory.
When Gorbachev insisted that missile defense be researched not in space, but only in the laboratory, the president adamantly refused. 11 intoxicating hours of summitry ended in bitter recrimination. But Reykjavik didn't end their new dialogue. I think, strangely enough, the emotional outbursts exposed their real characters, and that created a much deeper level of trust. Gorbachev no longer sneered at times about the president as a fool and a clown, and Reagan was confirmed in his Geneva hunch that the human Gorbachev would win out over the Leninist. Each discerned more clearly the would-be peacemaker in the other. And in private, the diplomats and foreign ministers kept talking.
Shevardnadze joked that he and Schultz lost count somewhere around 35 or 37 meetings. That's why I believe the Geneva summit had been so significant. Its success lay not just in breaking the ice between the leaders, but in fostering a culture of negotiation right across the Cold War divide.
And Star Wars became less of an obstacle. After the Democrats gained control of Congress in November 1986, it was unlikely that the Missile Defense Initiative would get off the ground. Reagan's credibility, meanwhile, was severely damaged by news that his administration had sold weapons to Iran to help finance aid to Central American anti-communists. He needed the good PR of a summit.
Gorbachev's readiness to come to Washington was a chance to boost Reagan's flagging domestic reputation.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
The December 1987 summit proved a historic breakthrough. The treaty to scrap intermediate-range nuclear weapons was the first agreement actually to reduce weapons stockpiles. It showed that the process of negotiation at the summit and lower down was now bearing fruit. In the summer of 1988, Reagan visited Moscow. During a walkabout with Gorbachev through Red Square, Reagan was asked whether he still thought the Soviet Union was an evil empire. No, he replied firmly, I was talking about another time, another era. The old ideologue could sense that the Cold War was coming to an end. That became clear in 1989, when the communist regimes began creaking towards democracy. In China, the leaders cracked down on political protest with ruthless brutality. But in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, as reform turned to revolution, Gorbachev chose not to use force to stop the overthrow of communism. And the experience of summitry was a crucial factor in his thinking. The Soviet Union was in a mess, but I believe it could have toughed out the next few years and kept up the arms race. Yet Gorbachev was convinced that the new relationship he'd forged with the West was more important than clinging on to the Soviet Empire. If Gorbachev had seen just the old Cold Warrior across the table, he would probably have held tight to Eastern Europe. But Reagan recognized the potential peacemaker in Gorbachev and reached out to him. The president's folksy goodwill helped create a new climate in which a superpower showdown became unthinkable. Both leaders also understood that successful summitry was a process to be worked at over time, and that it had to be grounded in contacts at all levels, not just the very top. Schultz, Shevardnadze and their teams did much of the spade work that made agreements possible. It was Neville Chamberlain who was the pioneer of summitry, with his gambit of a one-to-one meeting with Hitler. But Reagan and Gorbachev used their advisors to make summitry work as an instrument for peaceful change. Leaders who operate as lone rangers usually fail.
To keep the blood flowing, we also gonna let these fascists behind us know what democracy looks like. So y'all ready, huh?
Yet since the Cold War, these hard-won lessons appear to have been forgotten.
What do we want? And when do we want?
Some states that sponsor terror or seeking or already possess weapons of mass destruction.
Let's be under no doubt whatever. Saddam Hussein has acquired weapons of mass destruction over a long period of time.
The policy of my government is the removal of Saddam.
Recently, I think that inept summitry between self-confident leaders has helped mire Britain and America in a botched war in Iraq. Tony Blair marginalized his diplomats. He failed to think through the post-war scenarios, and he didn't pin down George Bush at the bargaining table. The roadmap for Middle East peace that Blair took as part payment for British support in the Iraq War proved about as valuable as Neville Chamberlain's notorious piece of paper. Summitry has always turned on the skills and egos of politicians. Sometimes the results have been disastrous. But the Geneva meeting reminds us that when the chemistry works and the follow-up is right, what Churchill called a parley at the summit can indeed make history.
Andrew Graham Dixon continues his journey through the art of Spain tomorrow night at 9, but next tonight we're sticking in 85 with the rock and roll years.